You know somewhere beyond conscious memory that there is a door you never opened, not out of fear, but out of loyalty to a version of yourself who vowed to forget what you couldn't bear to carry. It's there, behind a wall of thick silence, covered in years of emotional dust, and what dwells behind it isn't a monster, but an ancient echo still waiting to be heard, with closed eyes and trembling hands. Darkness hides nothing, it reveals, with surgical slowness, what daylight refuses to name. The fragments of yourself buried alive beneath layers of, it should have been different, beneath the weight of what you silenced. To keep the ground from crumbling beneath others' feet, beneath blind allegiance to a past that no longer breathes yet still commands your breath. There is a silence deeper than sound. It is an absence. It's condensed presence, the space where unshed tears turn to salt crystals inside your chest, forming small geographies of unmapped pain. Interior territories where time stood still and the self split into before and after, a secret never spoken aloud, only whispered into a pillow. You didn't suppress the truth, you protected it, as if it were a wounded child, wrapped in cloths of shame and fear, hidden in the basement of your psyche, fed with crumbs of rationalization, kept alive on the oxygen of maybe someday. But now, the air is thinning, and what once was protection has become suffocation, and your body can no longer pretend that thing isn't pounding on the wall, asking for passage. The mind doesn't lie. It masks, translates, distorts, but never erases. What you stored in darkness didn't vanish. It merely metamorphosed into symptoms. The insomnia that arrives punctually at 3 a.m., the emptiness that surfaces even amid a crowd, the trembling in your hands when touched unexpectedly, the sudden aversion to certain colors, smells, words that sound like rusty keys turning in a rusted lock. There's a moment, almost imperceptible, when the body decides to speak for you, once language no longer reaches the depth of what was buried. Then muscles lock, the throat seals shut like a hermetic chamber, the stomach knots itself into old tangles, and you realize it isn't you avoiding the past, it's the past trying to enter. Slowly, hands raised, unarmed, holding only truth in its palms. You don't need courage to face what's in the dark, you need curiosity. The same quiet attentiveness with which one watches a flame on a windless night. Approach not as judge, but as archaeologist of the soul. Gently brush the dry earth from memories. Lift fragments with gloves of compassion, and ask, unhurriedly, who were you before you learned to disappear in order to survive? The secret isn't what you did, it's what you felt and deemed too indecent to exist. The rage you dressed as submission, the desire you called sin, the pain you mistook for weakness, the scream you reshaped into a thin smile. And now all these disguises weigh more than raw truth ever did, because sustaining a lie demands muscles authenticity never asked you to build. There's a light that only arises within darkness, not the light that illuminates, but the one that recognizes. When you finally sit before what you've kept hidden, not to judge, not to erase, but to say yes, you too exist. Something in your nervous system relaxes. As if, for the first time in years, your body realizes it's no longer alone in the room with the ghost. And there's still an even older layer prior to the secret, prior to shame. A core of pure stillness, untouched, never corrupted, merely forgotten. It's not innocence. It's primordial neutrality, the space before judgment, the silence preceding the first word of self-punishment, the 0 point from which everything can be rewritten, without guilt, without haste, with presence alone. The body is an archive that doesn't use words. It stores in tendons what the tongue erased, in posture what the mind denied, in breath what the heart buried. Every tension is an unspoken sentence. Every chronic pain, a paragraph of unintegrated history. To heal isn't to delete the text, but to learn to read it with eyes that don't judge, only witness. You don't need to resolve the past, you need to relate to it differently. Not as victim, not as guilty, but as an adult returning to the childhood home who, for the first time, sees the furniture not as threats, but as objects that stood helpless witness to what no one knew how to name. And now, with steady hands, you can rearrange them. Psychic time isn't linear, it's spiral. You're not returning to the past. You're revisiting it with new resources, with maturity you once lacked, with compassion you once mistook for indulgence. And each turn of this spiral isn't regression, it's deepening, like a diver descending further not to get lost, but to find what the surface never revealed. There is beauty in the slowness of healing. It refuses to be instrumentalized. Can't be sold in 7-day packages, won't fit on checklists. It demands you learn to inhabit the between. The space between scream and silence, memory and forgetting. Who you were and who you're not yet. And it's there, in that threshold, that the new is born. The emptiness you feel isn't lack, it's uncolonized potential. It isn't what was stolen from you, but what you haven't yet chosen to fill. And when you stop fearing it as an abyss, you realize it's actually the only space where you can build something not echoing others. It's the womb of your own yes. Integration isn't fusion, it's conscious coexistence. Your wound itself doesn't vanish, it simply stops ruling. It now sits at the table with you, not as a tyrant, but as a family member finally heard, nourished, seen, and in being acknowledged, it loses its power to sabotage and becomes guide, not ghost. Silence, when you stop shattering it with escape words, becomes language. It speaks in respiratory pauses, in slower heartbeats, in gazes needing no translation. And gradually you learn to listen not with ears, but with the diaphragm, with feet grounded, with skin exposed to the inner wind that, at last, blows gently. There's an instant brief as a blink, when past and present coexist without conflict, not as scar, but as a golden seam in broken pottery. Kintsugi of the soul. You're not healing a wound. You're granting it aesthetic function, transforming the cut into a line of composition, the void into breathable space, silence into its own rhythm. Now, when night arrives, it's no longer an abyss, it's neutral ground where you can sit undefended, where the inner wind blows softly, where shadows no longer chase you but walk beside you as silent guardians finally recognized. And you, for the first time in a long while, don't need to switch on any light because you've learned to see with your eyes closed. And so, without fanfare, without declaration, you continue not as a survivor, but as a conscious witness, walking with your shadow not behind or ahead, but beside you, matching your pace, like an older sister who holds no more secrets. Only stories to tell while the world outside carries on, noisy, and you within, move like a slow-motion film in black and white, whole at last in sync. But there's still a secret deeper than the secret. The realization that nothing needs to be healed in order to be loved. The wound isn't a flaw in the design. It's part of the texture of the work itself. And when you release the demand for perfection, what arises isn't resignation, but ancestral lightness, as if finally, You've been granted permission to exist exactly as you are. Untranslated, unjustified, unapologetic. You're not returning to who you were, you're emerging as something that could only be born after darkness. You're not the same and you don't need to be. Transformation doesn't erase layers. It stacks them, like geological strata, each with its fossil, its mineral, its own time. And you now are the soil, not just the seed. And even when the world insists on demanding answers, you learn to honor not knowing, not as failure, but as spiritual posture. To remain in the question, without rushing toward the verb resolve, is a rare act of courage. It's there, in suspension, that the soul breathes with full freedom like the sea, which needn't name the tide to follow it. Finally, you understand. The secret was never a burden. It was a seed planted in darkness, waiting for the right moment to sprout. And now, palms open, unhurried, unafraid, you let it grow, not as redemption, but as continuation. Not as ending, but as the next verse in a poem you write slowly, with ink of silence and inner light.